Ladies and gentlemen, stop what you're doing right now. Because what I'm about to show you is not market gossip, and it's not another theory floating around financial Twitter. This is a document leak, a procurement paper trail, a locked-in contract that didn't just move the silver market. It may have quietly rewired the entire aerospace industry in one stroke. Silver didn't spike to an all-time record because investors got excited. It spiked because a real-world supply line just got severed, and the first people to notice weren't speculators. They were government procurement officers staring at an empty shelf. Here's the part that should make your stomach turn. A memo surfaced inside NASA's materials acquisition chain, marked for internal distribution only. And inside that memo is a single conclusion that changes how you should see the next 18 months. It wasn't written by YouTube commentators or retail traders. It was written by NASA's own procurement leadership, and it says the quiet part out loud: SpaceX has effectively monopolized NASA DES refined silver access in North America for the next year and a half. This isn't abstract. This isn't some metal. This is silver, the most electrically conductive element on Earth, the one material you do not substitute when signal loss means mission failure, when thermal management means the difference between orbit and catastrophe, when every sensor and avionics pathway has to survive vacuum, radiation, extreme heat, and brutal vibration. Without silver, you don't just lose efficiency, you lose reliability, and in space, reliability is everything. Now listen carefully, because this is where it stops being competition and starts resembling industrial warfare. On December 14th, 2225, SpaceX signed a materials acquisition contract securing 4.7 million ounces of refined silver for exclusive delivery over an 18-month period from January 1st, 2026 through June 30th, 2027. That's not a purchase order. That's a lock, a pipeline. A private vault being filled on schedule month after month while everybody else is told, sorry, you're not on the list. But the most shocking detail isn't even the number, it's the clause. The contract allegedly contains a monopoly provision that restricts major refiners from selling refined silver to other aerospace or defense customers in North America for the duration of the contract. Think about what that means in plain language. SpaceX didn't just buy silver, they bought silence, they bought exclusivity, they bought time. And in the modern space race, time is the only currency that matters more than money. And that's how you get to the moment NASA realized they were checkmated. Their own memo describes the crisis in terms that don't belong in a normal procurement discussion. It frames silver as a critical material shortage with immediate action required. Not next quarter, not we'll revisit the budget. Immediate. The same agency that put men on the moon, the same agency that runs complex multi-year programs with enormous redundancy and planning, was suddenly staring at a countdown measured in days. Because when your inventory is thin, when your supply chain is cut, and when your missions are built around components that cannot function without high-performance conductive materials, you don't have the luxury of debate. You have the luxury of panic. And the reason this story matters isn't simply that SpaceX secured silver. It's that this move reveals something far bigger. Silver is no longer just a commodity. It's becoming a strategic choke point in the 21st century industrial economy. The first battlefield is space. Let's break down why this is so explosive. Because most people still think of silver like a smaller cousin of gold. Something shiny, something that belongs in coins or jewelry. That is not what silver is anymore. Silver is infrastructure. Silver is a critical input into the physical architecture of modern civilization, and aerospace is where its importance becomes unavoidable. Every satellite in orbit depends on silver-plated contacts, silver-coated electrical pathways, silver-based thermal systems, and highly conductive interfaces that must function flawlessly, where failure isn't inconvenient, it's fatal. Now, place that reality inside the world SpaceX has built. SpaceX isn't just a rocket company, it's an orbital manufacturing machine. It's a platform that launches, replaces, repairs, expands, and scales hardware in space like a tech company ships software updates. Their Starlink constellation alone has grown into something that dwarfs almost every other space effort on Earth combined, and they aren't slowing down, they're escalating. The next phase is even more silver intensive. Newer generations of satellites are designed to handle vastly higher bandwidth, more demanding power requirements, higher frequency arrays, and more aggressive thermal control. That isn't achieved with optimism and good vibes. It's achieved with material science, with high-performance conduction, with heat resistance, with systems that can take punishment and keep operating. And when you scale that system into the thousands of satellites, you're not using some silver, you're consuming it as industrial fuel. Then there's Starship, the project that changes everything about the demand curve. Starship isn't a single rocket, it's an industrial pipeline. A concept of launching at a rate that turns space logistics into routine transport. The avionics, flight computers, communications arrays, radar systems, and sensor networks inside a high-end reusable launch system are not built with cheap, replaceable parts. They're built with the best materials available because the cost of failure is too high, and silver sits inside the nervous system of that machine. Here's the question that makes this whole thing terrifying. Why lock 4.7 million ounces when projected annual consumption? Doesn't T even remotely justify a number like that? Why secure enough silver to cover far beyond normal operational needs? The answer is not because they're building a lot. The answer is because SpaceX isn't only consuming silver, they're stockpiling it. And stockpiling is what you do when you believe the market is about to break. This is where the story stops being about rockets and turns into a resource doctrine. SpaceX isn't just building satellites. They're building a strategic reserve of the one material their competitors can't replace. A reserve that, by its very existence, becomes a weapon. It doesn't have to be fired. It simply has to be held. Because if you control the supply, you control the timeline. And if you control the timeline, you control the future. And if you're enjoying this breakdown so far, hit the like button and subscribe right now, because what comes next is the part the mainstream won't touch. We're going to connect the supply chain breakdown, the export clampdowns, the vault drain, and the pricing mechanics into one simple conclusion. This is not a spike, it's a structural repricing, and it has consequences far beyond the silver chart. Now we need to talk about the global side of this because no monopoly exists in a vacuum. The reason a private company would move like this is because the global system is no longer stable. The just-in-time era is dying. The idea that you can always procure what you need at the last minute is collapsing under the weight of geopolitics, supply concentration. An industrial demand that has outgrown the world's ability to produce frictionless material flows. Silver production isn't infinite. Mine supply is constrained, and refining is even more concentrated than most people realize. A huge portion of the world's silver refining capacity sits behind one gate, China. That means even when silver is mined in the West, the pathway to refined product often runs through channels that can be restricted, licensed, or redirected. And once refined silver becomes political, it stops behaving like a commodity and starts behaving like a strategic resource. That is why the timeline matters. The alleged SpaceX contract was signed before the world openly acknowledged the new restrictions and bottlenecks. That's the move of someone who sees the storm before the clouds arrive. It isn't luck, it's positioning. It's front-running a tightening system and locking the exits while everyone else still thinks the room is safe. And once the doors start closing, the scramble begins. Not just inside NASA, across the entire aerospace and defense ecosystem. Because these aren't industries that can simply pause for 6 months and resume like nothing happened. Their production cycles, mission windows, launch schedules, and contractual obligations are built around supply certainty. When a critical material becomes uncertain, timelines break. Penalties hit, programs get delayed, political pressure explodes. And quietly, the winner isn't always the one with the best technology. It's the one who can still build. That's why the NASA memo reads like crisis language. It's not dramatic, it's clinical. It's the voice of a procurement machine realizing its suppliers are no longer suppliers. They're controlled routes, and if you're a competitor calling the same refiners, offering a premium, begging for allocation, and you're told, we're contractually prohibited, you're not negotiating. You're being denied. This is where the narrative becomes unavoidable. In the old economy, monopolies were built around oil, rail, steel, information. In the new economy, monopolies can be built around materials so specific that they don't even register in mainstream conversations. Silver is one of those materials. Because it isn't just valuable, it's useful, it's non-negotiable for high-performance systems. And when demand becomes inelastic, price doesn't drift, price jumps. That's why silver's move isn't a normal rally. It's panic pricing driven by industrial realization. It is the market waking up to the fact that physical supply and paper supply are not the same thing. It's the slow death of the idea that a chart is reality. Because the real price of silver isn't what you see on a screen. It's what you pay when you need metal delivered, guaranteed now. And when you zoom out far enough, you can see the mechanics that make this a chain reaction. Aerospace pulls first because its tolerances are unforgiving. Defense follows because its schedules are political. Electronics follows because its volumes are enormous. EVs follow because supply chains are already strained. Solar follows because demand is policy-driven. And once the dominoes fall, the market doesn't correct, it resets. So let's connect the last dots because this is where the story becomes truly Machiavellian. The same figure at the center of this alleged supply lock isn't just the CEO of a private aerospace company. He sits at the intersection of capital, government influence, industrial production, and narrative control. And that combination creates a kind of power that doesn't need force to win. It simply needs leverage. If a company holds a massive private stockpile of refined silver while competitors face shortages, the advantage isn't subtle, it's existential. One side can build, the other side can't. One side hits deadlines, the other side starts issuing revised timelines. One side collects contracts. The other side loses investor confidence. One side becomes the default option, not because it's better, but because it's the only one still functioning. And then the market reacts, because markets always follow availability. When supply becomes scarce, price becomes violent. Premiums widen. Physical metal separates from paper pricing. The spot price becomes a headline number, while the delivery price becomes the real number. The world starts learning the difference between an asset you can buy and an asset you can actually get. This is why the vault drain matters so much. Because when inventories fall fast enough, the system doesn't smoothly rebalance. It starts making emergency choices. Cash settlement pressure increases. Delivery risk becomes a whisper, then a rumor, then a fear, then a stampede. And stampedes are where markets break, not because the math is complicated, but because human confidence is fragile. Here's the deep reality that hides behind all the noise. The silver market can tolerate price spikes. What it cannot tolerate is the loss of belief that claims are interchangeable with metal. The moment industrial buyers stop trusting paper promises, they stop hedging and start hoarding. And hoarding is contagious, because the first company to secure supply looks brilliant, the second looks late, the third looks desperate, and the fourth finds nothing left. So here's the question I want you to sit with, and I want you to answer in the comments, because it goes beyond one company, one contract, one price chart. If a single private entity can allegedly lock up critical industrial supply and indirectly force government missions into delay, are we still living in a free market? Or are we watching the birth of a new kind of resource empire where the future belongs to whoever controls the materials that make modern technology possible? Because if the answer is the second one, then this isn't a story about silver hitting a record high. It's a story about the next decade being decided not by innovation alone, but by access. Access to refining, access to stockpiles, access to supply routes that are quietly becoming borders. And once you see it that way, you realize how quickly this spreads. Space isn't isolated, it's the front line. But the same silver that makes satellites work also makes phones work. It makes EVs scale. It makes solar panels efficient. It makes high-performance electronics reliable. It's one metal stitched into almost every modern system we depend on. So when it becomes scarce at the top of the pyramid, the rest of the pyramid starts cracking. Now we arrive at the final reality, the one most people don't want to hear because it changes the way you think about timing. If you're waiting for confirmation, you're already late. Because by the time the mainstream acknowledges a real supply shock, the supply shock has already done its damage. The companies that needed metal secured it quietly. The institutions positioned themselves quietly. The price adjusted violently. And the public got the story only after the window closed. That's why this moment matters. Because if this alleged silver monopoly is real in its effect, then the world isn't just heading into higher prices. It's heading into rationing behavior, into strategic stockpiles, into industrial competition that looks less like capitalism and more like controlled access. And once that shift happens, price becomes secondary. Availability becomes everything. And that's the twist hiding in plain sight. A procurement contract can be a hedge without being called a hedge. A stockpile can be a strategic reserve without being labeled a reserve. If silver rises, the balance sheet value rises. If silver becomes unobtainable, the operational continuity survives. Either way, the holder wins. And that is the genius of resource control in an age where the most critical materials are also the most overlooked. So what happens next is not a mystery, it's a sequence. Industries wake up in stages, not all at once. Aerospace feels it first because it has the tightest tolerances. Defense follows because it cannot afford failure. Big tech follows because its scale is unstoppable. EVs follow because they're already battling materials constraints. Solar follows because it's policy-pushed demand with real physical requirements. And then, suddenly, silver isn't a niche market anymore. It's a mainstream bottleneck. The world will call it volatility. They'll call it a speculative mania. They'll call it a retail frenzy. But that will be a convenient lie, because the true driver is brutally simple. Industrial demand is colliding with concentrated refining, restricted exports, and stockpiling behavior by the most powerful players on Earth. That is not a cycle. That is a reset. And once that reset is underway, the only question that matters is who secured their position early, and who waited for permission. Because in a supply crisis, permission arrives after the shelves are empty. The contract is signed, the vault is filled, the missions are delayed, the competitors are cut off, and the market realizes too late that the real price was never the number on the screen. The real price was the premium paid by the first buyer who understood the rules had changed. This is what the silver monopoly looks like. Not a headline, not an announcement, a paper trail, a supply lock, a countdown. And an entire industry forced to operate on whatever ounces are left. Because when one player moves first, in a world where materials are becoming strategic, they don't just win the market, they rewrite it.